In a few minutes. Hi, everyone. I'm Miriam Bale. I'm the artistic director of Indie Memphis, and this is our regular Tuesday night movie club discussion. And I am so thrilled this week to welcome the programmer of the wonderful Tell Me Women Filmmakers, Women's Stories program on the Criterion channel. And the programmer is Nellie Killian, who I'd like to welcome. Welcome, Nellie.
Hi, Miriam. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for being here. I'm just going to give a little bit of background. So Nellie is an independent curator. She's recently programmed series for Metrograph, The Quad, Criterion, Museum of Moving Image. She was the senior programmer at BAM, where she organized comprehensive retrospectives on Chantal Ackerman, Buñuel, Cassavetes, John Dante, Leslie Thornton, and Chris Marker, and many others. Nellie, I want to talk to you about these films, but I also want to talk to you about putting this program together. As a programmer to programmer, it's like, you know, it's really great work, really groundbreaking way of grouping a kind of film, not only by year and era and style and gender, but by style and form. And I find it just put new context on films that I really love. So tell me how did you decide? Were there a couple films that first came to mind that kind of floated to the top that you thought, oh, this film is really important. How can I put this in a new context?
I think, the sort of long answer to it is that there were a lot of films that I had wanted to show, wanted to have like a context for. And a key one was Soft Fiction by Chick Strand, which I'd seen, I think, maybe shortly after she died. There was retrospective and restorations, and I watched it at, I think, an impressionable moment where for me, she was just always this canonical avant-garde filmmaker. But, that sort of tour that was happening with her work was actually her sort of like, the moment where people were recognizing this person that had been overlooked. And Soft Fiction is, just a favorite movie of mine, a film that, hasn't ever been available widely commercially for home viewing or anything like that. And I'd thought for, I don't know, 5 years, like on my long list of programs, like figure out some way to like do a series with Tell Me, with Soft Fiction. And I think that was something that had been like rattling around in my head. And one of the things that I thought about was this idea of women talking to women. And I had sort of been like, well, it needs a sharper edge. It needs a little more focus. Like that's not enough for a series. And then in sort of 2017, fall of 2017, as I was reading all of the sort of accounts of, abuses of power, sexual violence, all these things that women were experiencing. I was, I've told the story many times with the series, but, especially the story in the New Yorker, where it was just one story after another of these women describing how Harvey Weinstein had, abused them, that it was the same in every story, like I thought I was alone. I tried to get over it and I couldn't. I told my mother, I told my roommate, I told my friend. And what was so heartbreaking to me is that all of these women had these same sort of experiences of shame and blaming themselves and, all these things that they thought they were completely alone in. And I was just like, but they should know that other people have experienced this. And like, if those stories were more readily available, I think, you know, maybe they wouldn't have felt as alone in it. Maybe like it would have been easier to process. And I kind of realized that what I'd been thinking about with soft fiction, that it didn't need to be that much sharper, that actually women talking to each other was enough. And actually, and even the whole thought process of thinking that this wasn't a strong enough idea for a series was sort of like part of the reason that these types of movies don't show as much. So that was sort of the nut of it. And, you know, as I said, soft fiction was sort of very central to that. That's the one I'd been thinking about for many years. But, you know, when you have an idea like that and you're a programmer, you see other movies and you're like, well, that would fit with this amorphous idea I have about a series of soft fiction. Like Tell Me would be, Dis-moi, the Chantal Akerman movie would fit with that, or Audience, the Barbara Hammer movie would fit with that, sort of not knowing what it was. So I did have like a kind of constellation that I hadn't really painted a shape on yet, of films that fit this idea. And then I started doing real research and like really looking at films that women made, you know, that had, you know, women as their subjects, and sort of started drawing these distinctions then, because, you know, it would be huge if you didn't, that it was like, okay, like this movie isn't like particularly intimate, like it is like a woman making a movie about a famous person, but it doesn't have that intimacy that these other movies have, you know, et cetera, et cetera. And really just, you know, bringing sort of, once you have like a sort of a list of movies that you're thinking about, sort of bringing them to people that, you know, have a good knowledge base about this sort of thing, and saying like, is there anything else I should be looking at? Going to archives and talking to librarians and seeing if they have more suggestions, and just watching a lot. Yeah. And that's sort of how it came together. Yeah.
It's interesting. Like, it's obviously very central to like the second wave filmmakers and feminism of the 1970s or 1970s and 80s. And but you've also included things as recent as Leela Weinrub's Shakedown. Was that in the Metrograph series too, or was that?
No, I think it was actually too new at that point. Like it wasn't yet like a repertory title. It might have still been doing like festival stuff.
How did you decide to include that title with some of these more older, like more historical repertory titles?
Well, you know, it is very, I think that there's no doubt there's a lot of 70s and 80s stuff, but I did want it to sort of span. And, you know, there were things from the 2000s and 2010s that aren't in this final iteration, like several movies by Sonia Khan. And, you know, in terms of like the formal thing that I was looking at, Shakedown is just such an exemplar. And I think, I mean, I'm actually trying to remember the timing. I think I saw it either right after I can't remember when Shakedown premiered. It was either right after or right before this series happened. And it might have actually been right after. I think it might have premiered, whatever it was. I was like, this would be a great film for the series. And I had heard that, you know, like a lot of movies that are, you know, independently made, I think there was like a hard time like figuring out music rights and a number of things to get it into a wider audience, get it to a wider audience, get that distribution to like really work. And when I'd heard Criterion, I mentioned it to Criterion, and they said they'd been interested too. So it was sort of like a perfect storm of, you know, yeah, like a movie came along that was just this ideal version of the Tell Me series, something that's so intimate, and a movie that really could only be made by a woman who was so involved with the subjects and that had been shooting for years just because she loved, you know, she loved the subject, she loved the place, she loved like documenting it. And that type of intimacy, I think, is so central to all of the films.
Yeah, even the style works with these films and with like some of those classic 70s films of like I think like to have watched this film's journey, like, you know, the sort of DV aesthetic that really become key to the what the film is and how it looks. I think some people at first didn't know how to take that or where to put that, but when you see it with these films, it makes so much sense as like as an aesthetic choice with a history and like just something new to your eye, you know, like something that makes you pay attention more to the image. Do you know what I mean?
Definitely. I mean, I think it has like that home movie quality, especially in Shakedown, that is actually like a little, it feels a little different than a lot of even the 16 stuff, which I don't think people associate with home movies as much now, you know, as, you know, basically DV video was like what you, if you're in your probably even 20s or 30s or 40s, is like maybe what your parents were shooting when you were a kid. So like that kind of digital and or analog even video is really has that sort of immediacy of a home movie even more than I think 16 millimeter. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's so great too to see that. I mean, that's great that Criterion were already talking about the film because that means it's had such an. It's so great to see its path to go from before playing Criterion, it was playing Pornhub, and I feel like that's something that, you know, again is within that like very alternative distribution path that these feminist films share the same
Yeah.
kind of history.
I mean, and also just speaking of like the we, you know, we'd already announced and everything, or we'd already sort of been working on the series for a long time when the Pornhub thing was announced. And I was like, it's like so, to me, it's like so perfect to have this like heavy second wave film series and then have like the new movie that's debuting is like coming fresh off of Pornhub. It was like a perfect, like, you know, we take all comers moment.
But then when you see Barbara Hammer's like included in this, it works so well with like the themes in her films too. Like
yeah,
the famous pussy popping scene in Shakedown. I feel like I don't know if Barbara Hammer saw it, but she probably would have loved it.
yeah. I mean, like I mean, the dialogue. I mean, it's the dialogue in Barbara Hammer's movie is so much about like people not knowing what to do with her films and like,
Yeah.
but she has obviously such a clear sense of who her audience is, which I think is like a um, really beautiful thing. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I want to talk about the second wave some more because it's so, again, central to the series. And there really are, like, you know, related to what you said initially about, you know, this prehistory of how the Weinstein, it's happened before, you know, and I think that the history gets lost sometimes. But it's so important in feminist history, but also and also in film history. You can really see in these films women finding their language, like their visual language and their way, and that's the sort of searchingness seems so key for the films. But I want to talk to you about like a basic idea that it seems central to all of these films and was central to the second wave is consciousness raising. Do you want to talk about that? Let's
I
talk
was
about
actually just being like, we should talk about consciousness raising while you were asking the question. So I'm actually a little bit sad that one movie we weren't able to include that was at Metrograph is the women's film, which is a third world newsreel film that is was basically a film about consciousness raising groups. It was also used as a tool, like an organizing tool for women who are starting their own consciousness raising groups that like you'd almost see like the how-to of like these various consciousness raising groups that are documented in that film. But it's, to me, it's like consciousness raising is like a different way of saying like getting woke or anything. It's about like bringing a, you know, waking up to something that like might have been for one reason or another repressed in you or, you know, obscured from you, and or you were unwilling to accept that it existed. And I'd seen, I don't even know how I started watching all of these like feminist educational movies that like focus on consciousness raising groups, but it is like a subgenre that I'm kind of obsessed with. And I just like love it. There is something like so amazing about the way that they're kind of developing this language to talk about these things, and sort of like finding other people that like have sort of have the same inkling they do, and they're able to like figure out a way of talking about it and like identifying it. I just think it's like really beautiful to watch. And in a movie like Janie's Janie, which I think is, you know, very much in this vein, the way in which that process for her is a political awakening, like beyond feminism, that she kind of gains this whole level of empathy for like the Black people in her city, and like, you know, all of these things that she hadn't been thinking about, or ways in which she hadn't realized that she was prejudiced, like through sort of almost like self-love and recognition, she's able to like have this like larger empathy for everyone, which is just, I mean, that is like how that happens. And to actually see a person go through that process is, I think, really powerful.
Absolutely. But let's also talk about like the second wave feminism in the Anglo world, in all of the Western world, was very, was known for being extremely white. And so you definitely, so how do you, as a programmer, deal with trying to show what that historic world was, that was, noted for being exclusionary in some ways and for being very white, and then yet to do a program that doesn't feel that it's all bland, all one color, all like one style. How do you show something that feels more like a more diverse program? And I mean, we talked about Shakedown. This is a Black filmmaker making a film about a Black community. And then you also how conscious were you when you were putting things together of having it not just be a white program?
I mean, very conscious. It is inevitable when you start watching a lot of 70s, like you said, it's very white. And like to a certain extent, the people who've had the access to make even these types of movies have largely been white women, that there is more material coming from that has been, distributed in any way or in a library that, you can kind of find. So I think the question becomes when you're programming, like, okay, like, these are the movies that people know about, like a growing up female, incredible movies that people know about, growing up female, Joyce at 34, all of these things. But, to just accept that that is the canon is basically to just repeat the mistake of the past. When, I think most people would agree that like people have been biased, historically in what they show and what they celebrate. So the question becomes, well, do I just accept that? Or do I like dig a little deeper and see like what was maybe passed over, or what hasn't like entered this canon that was made, and like not just sort of blindly accept that like, well, these are the ones.
Yeah, and actually, a film shamefully that was new to me was Suzanne, which I hadn't seen before, and it's incredible. And it's a Black filmmaker making a film about her own family, and I was so sad that I had not seen this in all my deep diving in the past. Do you want to talk a little bit about that film?
Yeah, I mean, I think it also helps, Suzanne is a movie that I learned about when I was programming a series with Michelle Mater at BAM on Black women filmmakers before 1990. So I did have, through previous research, like I had already done some research into like Black women who were making movies in the 70s and 80s. I'd done a series on independent films in the 80s that also I was like trying to find documentaries and, whatever indies and stuff that were made by all sorts of people in that period. But Suzanne is just an incredible movie. Camille Billups is an incredible artist. She actually came when we did the series at BAM and talked with Finding Krista and Suzanne. And her partner, James Hatch, was also there. And she unfortunately died fairly recently. But she's just an absolutely singular artist. And both Suzanne and Finding Krista, a number of other works are like very autobiographical. And there's this kind of like easy formal play that I find like so intoxicating in her work, that, I mean, kind of getting back to what you were saying about Shakedown, that there's like this level at which she's making this movie, you know, sort of unearthing this family trauma, you know, a woman, her cousin, I believe, who had, drug problems and like various like, problems throughout her adult life that like, really stemmed from this abusive family dynamic and the ways in which her father abused her, the way in which her mother sort of stood by and let it happen, and trying to sort of reconcile this or air it out, I guess. And, of course, this is Billups' family. So she has this access to like have these very off the cuff conversations with everyone. But there comes this moment where she stages this kind of cathartic breakthrough between Suzanne and her mother. And it's not, I feel like it's the type of thing she can do because it's her family, that she can kind of take this sort of experimentation of how like they're going to talk through this and like stage it and light it and all these things in a way that, you might not do with subjects that you were less intimately involved with. And it's this, I mean, the entire movie is incredible. But that moment it just breaks into something totally different, where you have this incredible catharsis between these two women, and a real moment where it feels like they've broken through something in their relationship as well. It isn't simply about the movie, but it is about these two women.
Absolutely. And you're seeing that live, and it's framed in this very stagey way, but they're also like not facing each other. So it's not a direct confrontation. It's like about their parallel experiences. It's so weird. Like those moments where Suzanne is like saying, do you want to hear about this? And her mom is like, yeah, I know, I don't, I had the same experience. And it's sort of like, wait, you're not hearing her. But by the end, Suzanne hears her mom. She's like, I didn't know that you had the same experience that I did. And it's so beautifully composed in a way that allows for that to happen and shows parallel experiences and power dynamics and all of these kind of things. It's really, yeah. So simple tools too, to show something so profound.
Exactly. And like, you think, even like the way they're staging it, it's like it conveys all of this, but also like to a certain extent, it's almost like they're in a confession booth or something. Like they're both able to just say their thing, and it's to each other, but they don't have that pressure of like looking each other in the eyes. Like, I feel like that artifice that she puts allows something truer to come out.
Absolutely. I keep going back in my head as we're talking about these films to what you said about the initial kind of inspiration being these Weinstein stories. And I remember too, like reading those stories and being like, oh yeah, these stories I've not quite seen. They're doing a different kind of reporting too. It was like, instead of having it was substantiated by the fact that the woman told this story to someone else, to her friend. It was like, actually, I feel like that's one of the most significant things Ronan Farrow's done, is he's kind of changed the way we report on these things. But did you see On the Record yet, that film about Russell Simmons?
I haven't, no.
Okay, it's interesting because it felt like that was taking these stories to another level, because instead of just reading the stories, you're seeing them, and there's that confession, and there's something to hearing the story that's this other level. So it becomes, but it's very, talking head. It's like a very traditional talking head, and they're talking about trauma. And there are a couple scenes where smartly, instead of it just being talking head, it's like telling a story to a friend, which is a different kind of feel. But, you know, that's, I feel like, you know, you talked about what's similar to those stories of those Weinstein, but also what's so different about these films is these formal choices, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I mean, do you want to talk about that? Like what, like, yeah.
Well, you know, a lot of these movies are talking heads, but I think the what the women are saying and the sort of the ways that the stories are told, the ways that the types of stories that are told, it doesn't feel, I mean, it's not the illustrative talking head where it's like, you know, someone just like downloads some information to you, which I feel like is the kind of, you know, the horrible talking head movie. It's, you know, it's about the storytelling, you know, and it's about the women sort of in many of the films sort of figuring out how to even tell this story or like, you know, how to express this thing. And I feel like you often really do feel like their relationship with the director, you know, or, you know, in something like It Happens to Us, it's, you know, it had to be all women crew, and the women were basically admitting to doing something illegal, you know, to gain an abortion when it was illegal. And were, you know, that is also a film where many of the women's stories are very similar. And but that sort of weight of repetition and like hearing that over and over again, seeing these women's faces as they tell this story and like what having to go through this experience did to them, how it affected them is, you know, it's, I mean, that is the movie. That's the like even if there isn't like the formal flourish, I still feel like that attention is like formally something, you know? And
Yeah,
I think the obvious example of like the talking head taken to the, you know, most extreme is Bay tells her story.
a favorite of both of ours.
Both of ours, yes. Where, you know, Leanne Brandon had Betty tell a story and she had two rolls of film. So they did two takes. And she apparently agonized over, you know, how to put this together, how to cut it together. And then one day, like, you know, year into trying to edit it, she just showed that she put them back to back and watched them and was like, this is the movie. Like this sort of contrast between these two 10-minute takes of a woman telling a story once sort of focus, you know, the first time through really telling it is this kind of anecdote she's told a million times, kind of almost a charming story about her life. And the second time she really has spent the day sort of thinking about it when she talks about like how the story made her feel. She gets to like why this is a story she tells, which is because the situation like really upset her and like sort of like, you know, revealed all these insecurities and, you know, feelings about herself, brought all these things to the surface. And she talks more about how she felt than what happened, even though the story is the same, it's so different.
Yeah, when I saw this film, it totally changed my life. I saw it at a feminist film festival in San Francisco. I was thinking about it before the talk. I realized I saw it at the El Rio bar. Do you know that place? Like
Mm-hmm.
in the Mission.
Yeah.
And there was like a feminist film festival in the outside there. And I just saw this film and I was like, I didn't know you could do it that. I didn't know that a film could be that simple or could be so much about the stories we tell ourselves and our narratives and you know and about you know I felt the same when I discovered Jacques Rivette's films and like the idea of like just breaking down storytelling to the basics of the stories we tell ourselves. And it was interesting to see the interview you did with her with the director about their film distribution company, which I found out from this film New Day, and how she talked about yeah, that it's about how long she struggled to find that that's the film, that it's not about these flourishes or these editings or these, you know, that it's about about the way, I mean, because you hear in it, it's a story she's told so many times. And so you hear what's repetitive and you hear what's in between the words that she said so many times, like as if playing with like actors and their repetitions. And yeah, it's beautiful. It's formally daring, but it's not formally like filled with flourishes in this way. And you're right, like it is a talking head, but it's in a talking head in a, but it still is making interesting choices. Even, I mean, obviously the repetition, but even the way it's framed. And then like Chick Strand, soft fiction, like, do you want to describe that film? Because that's another like the one that you said was a basic inspiration. Like, how would you describe that film to someone who hasn't seen it?
Well, one final thing I'll say about Betty Tells Her Story, but I think it connects. You know, I saw that film in the library when I was researching the series. It was like on my like big list of women filmmakers on 16 millimeter to go through. And I saw it and I was like, every intro to documentary filmmaking class should show this movie. It's like so basic and like mind blowing that like no one's seen it, when it explains so much about like how to interview someone, like, you know, what it means for the interviewer to perform first to a certain extent and how you get past that performance or use that performance. Like just so many basic things that I was just like, and it's 20 minutes long. Like it should be on the first day. And instead, no one's seen it, which is, you know, the sort of tragedy of it. But like now, hopefully more people are watching it. But, you know, it's interesting, Chick Strand. So Soft Fiction is a film, 5 different stories that women tell that all are, I would say, like, they're not well-worn stories that these women have told 1,000 times. They're stories that the women are figuring out as they tell them. And they're told in different ways. Like sometimes it's like an audio track while you see the woman doing something. In one case, it's actually, the story was a letter, which I feel like no one knows this. I read it in an interview. The one where the woman talks about the cowboys.
It's clear. I think it's really clear that she's reading a letter that not by her, but that someone else wrote to Chick Strand.
But the woman who is reading it is a handwriting analysis.
Oh, I did not know that.
Yeah, no, it's not. I mean, there's no information that says that that's true. I just read it in an interview. Yes, the woman who's reading it does handwriting analysis at Berkeley. So when she's reading the letter and she has those moments where she's like, oh, she's like writing faster now, she's getting excited. It's like she's getting that all from the letter, the actual handwriting, which is fascinating.
About the eyes being small. Like that's, yeah. I have no idea. That's amazing.
I found that out like 6 months ago and it's been one of my favorite movies forever. But she talks, so the movie, like, you know, all of these women sort of, you know, are telling stories that are like very difficult to grasp. And I think very difficult for the women to even sort of figure out how they fit into their lives, either because they're absolutely overwhelmingly traumatic or because they're just kind of confusing, like the woman who wants to slide down the banister. Like, you know, there's just like all these different, again, it's women telling stories and coming to terms with these events in their lives, basically. And Chick Strand is a figure who, you know, is very important avant-garde figure. She founded Canyon Cinema, but she didn't get the recognition of a lot of her male counterparts. And she's an interesting one too, because I also feel like she was really, really like punk in her attitude and like, you know, kind of a, like, well, they don't want me. I don't care. Like, I'm not a documentary filmmaker. I'm not this, I'm not that. Like, there's like a level at which she was very like singular and like wasn't in any, like, it's not quite the same thing, I think. Like, you know, there's a level at which she was like so her own person and so outside of any community of filmmakers or school of filmmaking that like it's a different way of not fitting in. She was like above it all. I think actually like just making work on like a totally different level. But yeah,
so it's experimental and documentary.
It is. It's all of those things. And like, you know, it's another person where like, I feel like at one point I was like, you know, she could have just been in every documentary film festival or, you know, and all this and all that. But like, she was working in her own way. And I don't think those weren't the methods she was like, you know, interested in pursuing even. But soft fiction, I think, is actually all of her movies have like a real documentary center to them. You know, there's documentaries like central to her work. She trained as an anthropologist and all these things. But she does it in a very experimental way. And I think soft fiction is, that storytelling aspect of it is really central. And she finds a way of telling the stories in each case that's different. Like I said, the handwriting analysis, or, you know, I'm trying to think if there's one other one. Anyways, yeah, I think I lost track of the question like 5 minutes ago.
No, that's fine. That's perfect. I mean, I think that she does, yeah, there's like each story that she finds a different style to tell this, I think, each story. And then when she does do the talking heads too, like sometimes there's, you know, someone cooking naked. I mean, it's not just someone cooking. It's like completely a different image than you've seen. Or like, when they are close, they're not just like I feel like the typical talking head docs, like it's like medium close, like it's like this, and it's kind of moving, and that is very specific.
Yeah, I mean, there's the one, I feel like it's the final story, and the woman's talking about escaping the Holocaust, and she's very close in on her face and keeps on doing these cutaways. The woman is sort of stroking this cat on her lap while she tells the story, and it's, you know, she has this grip on the cat, you know, clearly for comfort, but it's like so uncomfortable to see, like this level of anxiety that's just completely present in her hands, you know. It's in her face as well, but like just that the movement of her hand caressing this cat sort of as she gets these words out is just, you know, you just feel the way that it's like twisting inside of her to get it to be able to talk about something like this.
Yeah, and it's interesting too, like again, to go back to your kind of flashpoint of the Weinstein and the feminism now, like this soft fiction especially, but I think so many of these films, like Joyce at 34, there's so many of the films, like Growing Up Female, there's a real ambiguity to the truth telling. It's not like, I feel like the feminism we're used to now is kind of took an aspect of second wave feminism that went from the 70s to the 80s, this like this empowerment, and the empowerment strand has gone like further and further into now I feel like feminism can take the form of either, you know, like sharing trauma, but then with then hopefully with a happy end, with an empowered ending, or like the general empowerment within, hopefully we're starting to see some of that end. But it struck me so much how there's like optimism, there's like a realism to, like, you know, women being mean to other women, competition, like, and these stories and soft fiction, it's like they're not, as you said, they're not sure how to feel about these stories. They were kind of working them out, and that ambiguity is so refreshing within a feminist context.
Yeah, I mean, you know, it was important to me. Well, one thing that was very important to me in the series was that it wasn't all trauma movies.
Yeah.
Like that it was another aspect of Me Too that I found annoying. But it was
I know what you mean. We will not, you will not get canceled. No.
Yeah. But it was this idea that, like, first of all, if a woman decides to tell you something like this, like, you know, that is like huge of her to do. And there's no like obligation for every woman to just like share bad things that happen to them, which I feel like was part of this, like being like kind of like you have this like responsibility to like share your story so that like, you know, to show that like everyone has experienced something along these lines, which I just found like that's actually not true. Like people can be private if they want, and like that's not a moral failing, especially about something that, you know, maybe they have a very difficult time talking about. But also like everyone was talking about like we should listen to women, like, you know, when a woman, you know, quiet down, like a woman's about to tell you about her sexual harassment story or, you know, sexual assault story. It's like that's actually not what listening to women is. Listening to women is listening to a woman tell a story about taking pictures of cowboys and giving them all blowjobs and liking it, and listening to her enough to know that that's actually where she is with it, that she had a great time. And like, you know, telling a story about, you know, any number of things where maybe like her reaction to it is not the reaction that you would have had or not the reaction that you would expect, and like listening with enough attention to sort of understand that nuance of experience.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I feel like that story is complicated though too, because I feel like she's also still processing
She
what it
definitely
is for
is.
her. Yeah. And there's like elements of it, but that's another story in soft fiction. And I totally agree with you. Oh, go ahead.
No, I find that one so interesting because I feel like I'm like, is she going to end up regretting this or maybe not? And like, she's still figuring it out, but like, it's really not to judge. And she hasn't made a judgment yet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's and the distance of her not sharing it too, it gives, and that's actually really interesting compared to the Weinstein thing, because there is a bit of like trauma porn, like within like On the Record or something like that, and having someone else read the story, a handwriting analysis, but even just that distance is a really different approach. I wanted to, just to give everyone a heads up, I could go on talking to Nellie forever, but I'm going to open it up to questions soon. So if you have questions, please write them in the Q&A box, or you can raise your hand if you're on Zoom. If you raise your hand, I can call on you, and you can either ask by voice or even by video if you would like. But don't worry, I won't put the camera on you without you. You have to give permission to be able to do that. And if you're watching on YouTube or Eventive, you can please just put some question in the comments, and then it will get to us. So go ahead and ask any questions in the Q&A. You can start. I'm going to ask a couple more questions to Nellie before we turn it over to the audience. I wanted to I want to ask about, as I keep going back to one film that touches on so many things we've talked about, and that is a film that actually, you know, when we talk about diversity and privilege, is the Yvonne Rainer's Privilege. Yvonne Rainer is feminist film hero, dancer, and I had seen her films. I got really interested in her. I think before I saw her films, I read her book. Her autobiography is called Feelings Are Facts.
Yeah. Yeah.
So important in my life. and then I saw her films, and I think and actually so many of these films, seeing them like 10 years later, 15 years later, for like, I'm a different person, I'm a different woman in a different page in my life, and that one especially, like, but also just her style and her way of interrogating. There's a great line, I think it did a screen grab, where the person who, well, she has a black deaf woman. Is she deaf, or is she just fluent? And
I think she's deaf. Yeah.
Yeah, black deaf women play Yvonne, and then she has the interviewee say, like, why are you interviewing me? White women have been interviewing white women for so long. And she really kind of interrogates some of these things. And then as far as like formal choices, they're bonkers and beautiful in this film. Do you want to talk a little bit about this one?
It's, you know, it's a little different in the ways in which it is sort of mixing fiction and documentary than most of the films in the series. But I think what she does with the documentary footage and sort of like what she creates in the film, like just seemed like such a perfect fit. And like, it ostensibly starts as a movie where women are going to be talking about menopause and the sort of experience of sort of approaching it, or being in it, being well past it, that sort of this moment in life that has not, to the mind of Yvonne Rainer or most of the women on the screen, like really been publicly discussed. And I think it is also, it's 1990, I think it is a lot of these second wave feminists like approaching menopause and realizing like how, they're talking about how they're like just medicalized and like, having to interrogate like their own feelings about no longer feeling as desirable, as much as they didn't think that that was central to their self-image. So all of these things are kind of swirling around this sort of jumping off point. But it becomes this sort of metafiction with a stand-in for Yvonne Rainer, going sort of in depth on a couple interviews with, I feel like the movie's so complicated. I feel like I'm just getting started. But this woman sort of, she's interviewing her about menopause, but then it becomes this sort of story about race and violence and, complicity and all these other things that this woman experienced when she was younger. And, it's a woman who actually doesn't want to talk about menopause, and she sort of deflects to telling this sort of insane story about living in New York when she was younger and like her neighbors, her relationship. It's, again, it's kind of hard to explain, but it gets into all of these sort of questions about representation and being on different sides of privilege, really, whether it's, the privilege of being young or the privilege of being old or the privilege of being white or the privilege of being, a man or like anything. And the ways in which all these things sort of intersect and people are experiencing like several of them at once, and how this is informing all of these interactions. And it is like, it's a movie that sounds like it would maybe be didactic or something, but it's actually like really warm in a way, like even though like she's using like, an acting style that can be like a little presentational and things like that at times, like you're kind of like the characters will spout occasionally like these like insane viewpoints. And then you find out that they're sort of just quoting someone else, or another person will come in and be like, why would you say that? That's like garbage thinking. And like, you've actually been watching for 5 minutes this person say something that's getting like increasingly racist without being checked. And you're like, holy shit, like what are they talking about? And then like when they finish, they're just like, and the person is like, that is horrible. And like, I think like actually letting the scenes go like that is so incredible, because you really do over and over and over again. You're like, what is she talking about? And then immediately the person just like, destroys it. The stand-in for Yvonne Rainer usually is the person who's just like, no. Like, what are you talking about? Yeah.
There was a dog in the back, so I muted. There was so many interesting choices in in just like quick cuts. And again, it's like about narrative. And I think it's a perfect fit for this, even though it's not a traditional documentary, but even what is that, as far as.
Yeah. And, and Yvonne Rainer is, I feel like, a filmmaker who should be on like famous on the level of like a Chantal Ackerman or something. She has an enormous body of, or not an enormous, but, a very substantial body of work, especially for a woman filmmaker. And she's, multidisciplinary. She's like legendary on so many levels. And yet it's like, you know, I don't think her work is as known as like many other people who, you know, she definitely deserves to be better known than. And, you know, to be able to have her film on Criterion, where I think it's like rightfully placed in sort of this pantheon, is great. Actually, like, you know, even beyond Tell Me, like, you know, to have all these works on the Criterion collection is great. Like, you know.
And so long, well deserved. Like, they absolutely belong in that same, even though a lot of these films are 20 minutes or something. Like, I think that is 20 minutes, 30 minutes. That's an awkward length as far as certain distribution routes. But within the series, it works so well. And for streaming, it also just works so well. That's actually something I wanted to ask you about, is that, you know, a lot of these films like New Day, and I saw these films, like originally they were distributed through like educational, you know, through the women's movement, through meetings and consciousness raising groups and these, and educational things about, you know, specific about social justice issues, but within this specific way, which is sort of different than the advocacy docs that we get now. And then, you know, you and I probably discovered these in, you know, these little screening rooms and little feminist film festivals. And, you know, I saw a lot of these films at like the New York Library or EAI and, you know, little, and I'm sure you did too. But how does that change that to now have them be so available? I mean, and I think that speaks to one of the films too, Audience, the Barbara Hamill film about, like, you know, who is the audience for a film, and how does a women's only audience change a film about women talking to women? How does it change something that is, how does it change being something on Criterion where then it's canonized or put into a new? So can you talk a little bit about those questions?
Yeah, I think where to begin? You know, I would hope that this is a jumping off point for people. Like, you know, you were just saying like all the ways that you sort of encountered these movies. And to me, it was the same for me. Like, you know, you go to a micro cinema and like someone is just like put up like a couple movies that, you know, whatever, it's an artist you like and these are movies they like, so you go and see it, and then it's like, you know, your mind is blown by whatever you see, or, you know, you are doing research and like, you know, you watch a lot of duds when you're doing research too, and then you see a Betty Tells Her Story and you're like, oh, awesome. And to me, that is always just, every time you see something you've never heard of that's so good, to me, it always just makes me realize like, man, there's so much out there. And you just have to keep on, you know, trying to find, you know, the good stuff that like you shouldn't, you know, that you wish more people knew about. And that like, you know, there's like a, you know, there's so much out there to discover, so much out there to watch, like, and hopefully people encountering this on like a larger scale on Criterion will make people realize like, man, you know, I don't really watch I mean, you know, on like the most basic level, I don't watch very many short movies.
Yeah.
Like, you know, maybe I should watch more of those. Or like, you know, I have never seen a movie by, you know, Yvonne Rainer or Chick Strand or, you know, even Chantal Ackerman or, you know, someone who is like so sort of central to my conception of what cinema is. And like other people just have, you know, never really had an opportunity. They've never crossed paths with these films. So to me, that's the great thing, is that hopefully this is like an opening up, and it's not like everyone watches these movies and then like goes back to just like watching like, you know, whatever, the Sight and Sound top 250. Like, you know, hopefully it like does like make people sort of expand their idea of what might be out there.
No.
And ask for more too, you know, like that's the great thing, is that people seem to actually be watching the movies, and like it makes me happy that like, you know, you put it out there and then people watch it, and it's not there is an audience for it.
Yeah, and it's, as a programmer, it's so different than playing it in one cinema, I'm sure, to have like so many people able to watch it at any time and watching things that they just are probably not on the radar in ways.
Well, it's really nice. You know, I feel like what often happens in screenings is when you program something in a cinema, it's like you go, you put on the show, people see it, and then all those people saw it. And like, if it was like a great show, they all say, man, like, you know, they tweet, they like, you know, whatever. And then everyone's like, where do I see it? And it's like, well, it was only showing once. And actually that, you know, I guess just keep your eyes open. Maybe like some of these shorts will show up on other programs somewhere down the line. Like with this, it can actually grow that like if someone sees one of these movies and likes it and says something about it to their friends or puts it online, like those people can actually then just go watch it, which is great. Yeah.
It is different though, watching it alone than having those, you know, like watching it alone on your computer somehow feels different than watching it doing research in like a screening room. And it's certainly different than those screenings, you know, that we've experienced where there's like 5 people in a screening room and it changes your life forever. And you all remember that you were there in that moment. And so, I mean, it's definitely mostly an advantage, but then I'm also aware of that it's a different experience.
Oh, definitely. And I don't think you have to look much further than Audience by Barbara Hammer to like get some nostalgia for being able to actually go to the movies, because that movie is about Barbara Hammer bringing her work to various feminist film festivals around the world, in San Francisco and London and Toronto and Montreal. And it's one weird thing to me is, you know, there's countless movies about like the process of making movies, like, you know, the process of even getting a movie greenlit has like, you know, a pretty large body of work, but there are not very many movies where about a filmmaker sort of grappling with an audience response to their film, like a movie that's about going to a festival or, you know, getting reviews or, you know, seeing, you know, whatever. That sort of reception thing is just like not something that's dramatized, which I find it's interesting. I mean, you know, for an art form that, you know, like most art forms is obsessed with itself, you'd think that all aspects would have been like thoroughly mined at this point. But Barbara Hammer makes this movie about bringing her films to these film festivals. Each stop on her tour, she screens the footage from the previous stops to the new group. And as it goes on, it goes from her sort of, you know, doing like man on the street interviews of people going into her show at the Roxy in San Francisco, to like her in London doing this like sort of talk back where like all the women are talking not only about the movies they saw, but about like their sort of perceived differences between their community and the lesbian community in San Francisco. And then as it moves to Canada, in Toronto, it's like an all women screening group. And they start talking about the ethics of even allowing men to see Barbara Hammer's films, and like, you know, this sort of line of like pornography versus an art film, and or like erotic films versus pornographic films. And, you know, if there's ways in which her work could be co-opted by heterosexual men. And then it moves into just like party mode when it gets to Montreal, where all the women are like hanging out and like kind of gushing to each other about like this incredible thing they've had. You kind of get like this full theatrical experience in 30 minutes of watching the movie, from like standing in line to like being out at the bar afterwards, like talking about what a great show it was. And your guide through it all is Barbara Hammer, who is the most charismatic person who ever lived, who is flirting so hard with everyone. I mean, if she was a man, it would be like a little troubling. The fact that she is definitely like getting laid at every stop.
Very open about it. Very open about it. It's great.
Yeah.
And like, but everyone loves her, and you understand.
She's perfect. Yeah.
No, she's great. And Montreal looks like lesbian haven for some reason at that time. I don't know.
Oh, yeah. And like they're all just being like, come to Montreal.
Like, okay, let me come to Montreal. And they, but it's also interesting because that's like such like, it's showing that subculture of these women's films and the lesbian films that's so important for these films. And in different ways. So many of these films, they were all part of their own, like, you know, feminist subculture, or they weren't quite in the feminist subculture, like someone like Chick Strand or Carolee Schneemann, who like was not quite with other women and kind of like did her own thing. And yet, and it's just to me crazy, like going back, like, you know, to me, all of these women are such rock stars and such heroes. They're so the same as Scorsese, and like, and yet no one, like, it's bizarre to me that they're not as known. And I'm so grateful for your having your series, having these films on Criterion, and I hope that they'll become other people's rock stars as well. I think I really would like to open it up to questions, but everyone is being shy. Does someone have a question? Please don't. I've never, you must have questions. Please go ahead and type a question, or you can raise your hand.
If there's anything
so unusual. I think that maybe they're just gonna go, maybe I've talked too much, or maybe they're gonna go watch. Maybe we've covered everything. Well, is there
completed the chat?
Oh, great. Okay, it's not in the question, it's in the chat. But let's see, there's a question. It's not a question, it's a comment. Just, that this was the thank you.
Thank you, Carolina. Yes.
Well,
yeah, I'm trying to think if there's any movies that we talked about a lot, but
anyone's, well, another one we talked about, like formality, like I think that I love those films that are the thin line between documentary, I mean pure documentary, but just like a certain formalism, like soft fiction, but also is it Clothesline? That's such an interesting film as far as just being sort of abstract in its way, as well as being very much a documentary.
Yeah, it's so beautiful, like the way that she's shooting these clotheslines and just doing this like pretty complicated collage of the women's voices telling you stories about their relationships to laundry. Like, I found that movie, it was on a list somewhere, but then it was streaming on Folk Streams, which I thought was interesting, because it is such a like folklore thing, but just about people do the folk art of doing your laundry, and hanging it on the line. And how, I mean, one thing that's really amazing to me about that movie is it's 1980, and you really realize that's like an inflection point where so many people are getting dryers and washers, and like it's like this whole thing is just, these women are talking about like how this dominated their life. And like, now 40 years later, it's like, it's actually funny. I've been hand washing and line drying since quarantine started.
Have you? Just because you don't want to go to a laundromat?
I don't want to go to the laundromat, and I have I don't have a line, but I have a fire escape that I just like hang everything out on. But it's so funny. Like, it's just like, I haven't done that in a long time. Like, not since I was a kid.
Wow. I'm sure you think of this film sometimes in the way that you're hanging laundry and wondering if people...
I think about how it looks, from outside, to everyone walking by and like seeing my clothes. Yeah.
Oh, that's great. I think that they're really, you are a shy bunch, but this was such a delight to talk to you about these films. And, I just, as I kind of tweeted, like, I feel like we've been doing these conversations every week, and I just feel like there's not much more important than, two people talking to each other. And that's what these are about. And that's what your series is about, even though sometimes the other person is a camera. And that's so fascinating. So thank you again for this beautiful series.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you all for coming.
Bye, everyone. We'll be back next Tuesday. See you later.